that awesome connection. It also just reminds me of how long we've both been doing this work. You know, it's as I tell people, and if you read my bio, you know that I'm a runner. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So we are somewhere in the middle of that race right now. We're not near the end, but we're getting closer. So I hopefully you all read my bio. It's a snapshot of what I do. And I know I don't have a lot of time, but I want to set a little more context for what I do currently and how this connects to all of you, I think. So I have a background as a professional chef, and then went back to school through my Bush Fellowship to get a master's in public health nutrition, because in my work in the industry, I really became much more connected to the community around local and sustainable food, and the big gaps in knowledge and skills and education that were sort of keeping people from successfully getting themselves or their communities or really the planet healthy. And I felt that I could use my cooking skills and my experience with teaching to kind of make those connections and close those gaps. So I now teach at the University of Minnesota. I teach, and that's where I am right now in my culinary lab, getting ready to teach a bunch of nutrition students. I teach classes basically all at the intersection of human, community, and planetary health. And I use cooking really as a tool and a skill. I think it's pretty vital and pretty fundamental for people. Again, both for self-care and for what other kinds of care. But I think we need to understand how these things are related. I don't think you can teach about food and cooking without teaching about social determinants of health and about regenerative agriculture and all the things that kind of come together around these things. So that's where I'm coming from. I also do quite a lot of work now in the clinical space, doing practitioner education with an integrative doctor colleague, and also working with both mHealth Fairview and Hennepin Healthcare in the food as medicine work that they're doing that is really growing and exciting. And that's everything from cooking classes to these kinds of workshops with health professionals and clinicians. So welcome to everyone. I think all the work that all of you are doing is incredibly important. So hopefully this will be of value to you. Okay, next slide. Everyone has a food story. And what I mean by that is, if it's not obvious, we all come with a relationship to food. That relationship is evolving, changing all the time. It starts, probably before we're born, right? Because we're literally engaging with food in the womb. And it tells us a lot about kind of what's going on in the context of our experience. Now, if we had more time, I would have you all pair up and do a little food story activity where you're telling your food story for a couple minutes to somebody, and then they're telling you their story. It's not a conversation, it's just a listening and talking activity. But it can be anything. There is no right or wrong answer. So a memory, a reflection, a recipe, experience, a person in your life. Some people have very complicated or difficult relationships with food. That's part of a food story as well. But we love to, I do this with all my classes, and what I love to remind people of is this activity takes about 3 to 4 minutes. So whatever we are doing, whatever our work and whatever our context, even if you're a doctor in a patient visit, you potentially have time to do this activity. And what this does is it gives you a lot of information about somebody, because as I'm sure you all know, every individual is different. There is absolutely no one right answer for somebody's condition or needs or experience or, related to their personal health or some of these other issues. So it's just a really powerful way to start a relationship, especially if you're going to be engaging with somebody around food and their food choices. And I think it builds trust from the beginning. So when you have a chance, think about how you might have that conversation with anybody, really. Next slide. Maybe you're familiar with this. I'm sure those of you who work in public health have seen this or something very similar, but I think it's also really important for us to understand kind of where health comes from. We like to think a lot that healthcare is what creates health, but it's really kind of, if you look at that bottom 20%, that's where healthcare it relates to or influences human health, meaning that most of the things that impact our health happen before we end up in the clinic or at the hospital. And healthcare tends to be more reactionary. These other things, socioeconomic factors in particular, have significant influence over human health through all of these various things: education, job status, family and social support, income, community safety. And as you see, 50% can be traced back to your zip code. So these things are incredibly impactful in terms of what kind of resources people have, what kind of knowledge, what kind of access people have to the basic things that we know are important for health, like food, physical environment, obviously part of community safety and housing. And then while this says health behaviors, I like to acknowledge that not all of these behaviors are totally by choice. Some people are dealing with all kinds of circumstances and situations that put them in a situation where perhaps they can't choose healthy food or even move outside because it's not safe, or alcohol use is something that is a part of a bigger story. So again, 80% of the things that influence health are not people who are practicing healthcare. And part of what I think is really important is for us, and I know many of you, this is what you do, but is getting upstream and really looking at all of these things that we can influence before people end up being sick and needing care. Next slide. Just a little more context setting, and you may all also already know this, but this is a pretty good representation of what most people in this country are eating on a daily basis. That giant yellow section is processed foods. The official term is now ultra processed foods, which is distinct. Yeah, shocking and kind of not if you think about it. And even that little green triangle, which is 12%, half of that, if you look at the fine print here, might be something like nuts in a candy bar. So even the plant food that people are eating isn't necessarily coming from like a whole plant source. So about 6% right now, as far as we can tell, of what most Americans are eating on a daily basis is coming from plants. And I will be very clear, I don't propose or suggest any particular diet. So while I am absolutely, for many reasons that you'll see, a proponent of a very plant-forward or plant-heavy diet, I think there is room in our diets for all kinds of things. There are a lot of things that influence what and how and why we eat what we do. And so it can look a little different for everyone, but it needs to be more than 12%. Next slide. And again, I am very invested in the relationship between human and planetary health. And so that last slide really overlays with this one pretty directly in terms of the production of those foods that we eat the most of also has a very significant impact on the environment. And the next slide actually is a really nice visual. You can go one more. This is the double pyramid. It's actually from the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition, which is part of the Barilla Pasta Company, but they're an Italian-based company that does an incredible amount of research around climate-friendly and human-friendly diets. And what you can see here is, that sort of standard pyramid that many of us are used to on the left, which shows, the base of that pyramid is what we should be eating the most of in terms of our own human health. So lots of, as you know, plant foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, olive oils and quality oils, et cetera. And on the right, that same pyramid is the impact of the production of those foods on the environment. And so not surprisingly, what's best for humans also has the lowest impact on the environment and vice versa. So a pretty straightforward, I think this is a really useful visual for people who, I've shown this to middle schoolers and I think it makes sense to them. So pretty easy to understand. Also want to acknowledge that there is a very, very important relationship between our guts and our brains. Some people call the gut the second brain. There is a direct relationship, meaning the vagal nerve that goes between the brain and the gut, and the breathing that Linda led us in the beginning has an actual physiologic effect on how our body changes. So we are designed to be in fight or flight mode, which means if we're eating food, we are not really absorbing or digesting the nutrients in that food because we're set up to be in protection mode. And one thing we can do is take some deep breaths and let our body know it's okay, it's safe. You are now able to transition to what we call rest and digest mode, and you can eat those same foods and have a lot more absorption and a lot fewer digestive issues. And that's important not just for your gut, but your brain is very impacted by all of the good bacteria or not so healthy bacteria in your gut. As you can see, it goes both ways. So everything from, physiologically brain health to mental health, but also skin and cell production. We have so many neurotransmitters in that vagus nerve that we really, really need to nourish the gut in order to keep those healthy. Next slide. Really quick rundown on the macronutrients. Sorry, my screen just moved. Really quick rundown. This is probably also something that you all know, but I like to remind people, just like that old pyramid that we grew up with, and now my plate, which has absolutely no visuals that relate to food, I'll just say. These are the carbohydrates that are available to us. So all plant foods are carbohydrates, and all carbohydrates have fiber. However, the quality of those macronutrients matters. And so the source matters in terms of how much fiber and, again, the quality. When I say quality, I'm not talking about like financial value. I'm talking about how natural is it? How close to its natural form is it? And so here you can see everything from fruits to grains to legumes to pasta to vegetables, all great sources of carbohydrates. And most important is just a diversity. You can see all the different colors there. If you're getting different colors and different forms of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, you're pretty certain to be getting all of the diversity of micronutrients you also need. Next slide. So just like carbohydrates, proteins are very diverse. Again, I think everyone knows that animal proteins, meat and fish and chicken, are good sources of protein. They are not the only sources by any stretch. So again, legumes, nuts and seeds. Dairy, I want to be very clear, dairy is not a food group. It is a macronutrient, or it is actually all three macronutrients. It is carbohydrate, protein, and fat, but it's primarily in the protein section. So it's a great source of those nutrients, but it is not a food group. And milk is definitely not the best source of dairy if you're going to choose dairy. We can have a whole conversation about that, but I won't go into it now. The other thing I'll just point out is there are vegetables in this image too. So vegetables also include some protein. So keep that in mind. And next slide, fats, my favorite. Super, super important for all kinds of nutritional functions and culinary functions. And you can see, again, there's dairy, two forms of dairy, there's cheese and yogurt. So fats, important. Quality matters a lot. We need fats for all kinds of things. We need for cell creation and for brain health and for absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. But the quality, again, matters. So the source of that fat, olive oil, avocado oil, is different than something that takes chemicals and heat to really become a fat. So really, I like to talk a lot about quality in terms of macronutrients rather than talking about specific foods, and helping people understand that if you can identify the source of something and you know that it's a fat-containing food naturally, like olives, that's a good piece of information to make a decision about whether that's something you should include in your diet. It can be really overwhelming. I don't get into the mono and polyunsaturated fats because I don't think it matters, and I don't think you need to know that stuff. I think it just matters if you kind of know what you're putting in your body, and if you're mixing it up and combining a lot of different whole ingredients, which I know is a big part of what this whole project is about. Next slide. And this is just an image that I created. I teach through the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the U. They have a wonderful graphics department. And so this is an attempt to sort of represent the work that I try to do. I believe that we need to understand the food system and how complex it is, because it makes the kinds of choices that I'm suggesting you make challenging. We need to wade through and navigate a lot of marketing and a lot of things that seem like they might be good choices, but it's a little hard to tell, and a lot of packaging and a lot of ingredients, and that's a really important skill. I think that's probably the most important skill that one can learn in order to sort of stay at that intersection of human and environmental health. And the last slide, I think, oh no, there's a couple more. This is just some fun. You also should enjoy your food, right? Food should be joyful. It should be delicious. There's so much flavor. There's so many ingredients. I loved reading all of the things in the chat that people were saying. I am absolutely, and this is why I think cooking is a skill, an important skill in all of this, is because people, first of all, that part of that food story will tell you what people already know. A lot of people know a lot already about what tastes good and what they ate when they were growing up, or what their community or culture or tradition makes that's really delicious and really fresh. And so you can see in this wheel, there's just a spectrum around the world of sort of regional spices and flavors, but they're all connected in some way. So that's kind of a really cool way of thinking about this as more than just ingredients. This is culture, this is environment, this is family, this is tradition, and it's flavor, and we need to include that in order to make this enjoyable. And I think food can be really delicious. I know food can be really delicious. I spend a lot of time teaching people about that, but it doesn't have to be complicated. And I think that we need to take that kind of mystique away and just really give people the power to be confident in the kitchen. Next slide. Another version of, I like to remind people there's only 5 flavors or tastes. Only 5: bitter, sour, sweet, umami, and salty. That's not a lot. Everything is a combination of those. You can see I kind of showed the little spectrum of some ingredients that go from one end to the other. But I think once you understand, like, oh, this is bitter and sweet, I like that combination. So I'm going to use things to make something that tastes kind of bitter and kind of sweet, because those are the flavors I like. So, once we start kind of paying attention to what we like and what those tastes are, and then what foods have those flavors, then we can really start to play. And that's what I think is the fun part of cooking. Next slide. Quickly, you can just go through these. This is just some guidance we give to our students, just to help both them and if they're trying to help clients or patients. How can time is the biggest barrier that people feel that they have. I am a little bit of a pusher back about time, because, as Linda mentioned earlier, these little devices we have are really big time sucks. When I was in grad school and I was researching this same topic, it wasn't cell phones, it was TV. But I'll just let you know that the average number of hours that an American was watching TV about 15 years ago was at least 4. So even 1 hour a day, we are all, I'm not going to say wasting, but it's flexible. We'll just say it's flexible. And I'm a big fan of planning, and there's a commitment to prioritizing this, but there isn't. It's possible. It's very possible to do it if you want to, but it takes some planning. It takes some thought. It takes some basic skills again, and, you know, knowing kind of what you like and building your pantry and all of those things so that you get to the place where you can just come home and have stuff, you know, at your fingertips, or you will have roasted a huge pile of vegetables on Sunday that you just throw into your stew or your frittata or your stir fry. So I think it takes a little investment up front, and then we can set ourselves up for success. And next slide. Was this the last one?
No, we've got a few more.
Okay.
Should I keep going?
Slide.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And
yes.
You know what I'll do? I'm just going to start demonstrating right here. So this is something I start with every class. I start with a basic salad dressing recipe, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is because almost all of us buy salad dressing, and it's a $3 to $5 investment for something that is pretty basic, but also has a bunch of other things added to it that if we make it at home, we don't have to add and we don't have to wonder about and not know about. And it is ridiculously cheap to make something like this at home once you have the supplies, right? So this is where building your pantry starts to happen. But the thing is, if I buy olive oil for my pantry, I'm going to use it in my salad dressing, but I'm also going to use it in my stir fry. And I'm also going to use it when I'm sauteing vegetables and when I'm making my frittata and when I'm roasting my vegetables. So it's going to pay off over and over and over again for that initial investment. But I'm starting my salad dressing with a basic fat or oil. So again, back to the fat, which is fundamentally important for flavor and again for all those other reasons, those nutritional reasons that I mentioned. And I'm going to add, I have some red wine vinegar, but any vinegar that you enjoy will work. So I'm going to combine these two things. So right now I've just got oil and vinegar, and that alone would actually be fine for a dressing. I'm going to whisk it together. However, it's not really going to blend, right? It's not going to emulsify. So it will be fine, but when I pour it on my salad, it might separate a little bit. It's not going to have a huge amount of sort of combined flavor. So what's super fun and cool about food is that it also has this chemistry element, right? So I've got my oil and vinegar or my water and approximate amounts of each. I'm going about half and half with the oil and vinegar, but this is where you get to decide, right? That's the other wonderful thing about making your own dressing, is that if you like it more vinegary, you can add more vinegar. So I do about half and half. That's where I kind of land, but no rules on this. And that's why there's not amounts in there, because I really want people to sort of start trusting their intuition. This is a really low risk way to start playing around with that. So I've got my oil and vinegar, not going to mix all that well. So the wonderful thing about food, as I was saying, is that it also has this chemical function. And so in the case of this dressing, I'm going to add a little bit of honey. You can use maple syrup because I like a little bit of sweet to balance it. But the other cool thing about that honey is that it's also going to emulsify my dressing. Now it might be a little sweeter than I want. So I'm going to do one more thing. I've got some mustard here. I'm going to add my mustard. So either one of those are emulsifiers on their own. But together, now I've layered flavors. I've got 4 ingredients, still about 30 cents worth of ingredients, but I've got this pretty layered, flavorful dressing. I will add salt. Salt is incredibly important, again, for our health, but also it has these important functions in food preparation, in particular bringing out flavor, but also absorbing water when you're doing something like roasting vegetables and you want them to caramelize. So 5 ingredients, pretty basic staple pantry items that I can use in many different ways, way, way less expensive. This will last in the fridge for weeks. And now you have this basic formula that you can do multiple different ways. And so you can see in this little chart, there's some suggestions of these different components, but it's not even limited to that. There may be other things that you have or that you enjoy that aren't even on this chart that you could make a dressing out of. So that literally took me a minute. The most important thing, honestly, is having the things on hand so that you can do this. Doing it, I can't think of a single person. I literally have done this with 5-year-olds, and I've done it with people with intellectual disabilities. Anybody can make a salad dressing, right? And then you just go from there. So once you realize, oh, I can do that, then, you tackle the next thing. So it's not a like all or nothing kind of proposition. For me, this is like step one. You get really comfortable with that. Once you start making your own dressing, you may never go back because you realize how easy it is. And also you have 100% control over what's in that dressing. And that's the most important skill with cooking. Okay, we'll go to the last slides real quick. And again, mindful eating, I already talked about this. Linda is an excellent resource for this kind of information, so I don't need to go into it too much. But again, just to say that 1 or 2 deep breaths before you eat will dramatically change your enjoyment, number 1. Number 2, your digestion. And number 3, your awareness of when you're satisfied. A lot of students I have, they always have to do a mindful eating activity. A good number of them will say, I noticed I was full before I was done eating. I don't usually notice that when I'm watching TV or looking at my phone and eating. So there are many benefits. And I'll just say, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember to value eating time. This is something that society has sort of taken away from us. Work culture and fast culture has kind of taken away. And that even 20 minutes, 15 minutes that it takes to just sit down and not be distracted by anything is really important for ourselves. And, if you're sharing meals with other people, it's an incredibly important community building experience, and also just a time to, again, nourish ourselves. It's, I talk about nutrition, but really I'm interested in nourishment. And that's really important for our overall well-being. So it's something we can all do. And I promise you, you will not be less productive or lose important time by taking the time to eat. And this is just a nice visual of what I've been talking about. All of these things are related. They're intersectional. There is not one thing that exists without being very connected to everything else. These are the classes I teach at the U, and I will add that I also co-teach with this MD continuing medical education class for health practitioners. So that's anyone from nurses to doctors to pharmacists, that kind of thing. And we are thinking very, very seriously about a non-health professional, a non-medical education version of that class, because there's so many folks like all of you who are doing wellness work and doing health related work, but you're not an MD or a nurse. And we want to make sure that you're not missing the opportunity. So keep an eye out for that information. All right. And I have a few minutes for questions if we have time for that. Otherwise, you can always, Linda and Kelly know where to find me and how to find me. And I'm happy to respond to emails and that kind of thing. And you can find my cookbook also. I often forget to talk about that, but I published a cookbook. It's a very family-friendly, family-focused cookbook, and I love to get that out to folks if they're interested.
So you kick that door open. We are at time, but if there are questions, please jump on it now.
What's the name of your cookbook, Jenny? We'll put it in the chat.
It's called Cooking Up the Good Life, and it's from the University of Minnesota Press. Someone told me that they were out of stock on Amazon, but I have them personally, and I'm happy to drop off if you're local, and then I can sign them. Somebody asked about cookbooks. Oh gosh. Well, some of those visuals I had came from a great book called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which I really love because she presents things in terms of a little bit more around formulas and what makes sense together and the functions of ingredients, which I really love. And they're beautiful watercolors in that book. I think for really, really basic, just reliable stuff, I think Mark Bittman's, some of his earlier books are great. if you're looking for stuff with more sort of health related advice, Mark Hyman is good. He's a little too much of a marketing machine for me, but some of his content is really good. For websites, I like The Smitten Kitchen. I like Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Thank you. I like, gosh, you know, I have about 50 cookbooks in my kitchen, but I rarely use the recipes. I just like to read them and get inspired. I think Vegetable Literacy by Deborah Madison. Deborah Madison is the sort of founder of the vegetarian movement, I feel like, of the 70s. She wrote a book called, what is it called? It's kind of like The Joy of Cooking for Vegetarian Cooking. But her more recent book is called Vegetable Literacy, and it's a beautiful sort of exploration of what grows in which families and what makes sense then to cook together. And it's just very basic. Her stuff isn't complicated, but it's just very intuitive. So those are some thoughts off the top of my head.
And if someone is put off by the price of olive oil and avocado oil, any suggestions?
Yep, I totally get that. So I have a few suggestions. One is buy what's on sale. Number one, like I'm not invested in any particular source. And the other thing I'll say, and this is especially complicated for folks who really have limited resources, but investing in a quality oil is a huge investment in your health. The difference between a vegetable or soy-based oil and an olive oil is a big one. So it's something to do over time, right? Again, you're not buying a bottle of olive oil for one meal. So I bought a quart of olive oil, I think for $12 on sale, and that's going to last me weeks. So when you think about it that way, it's a little, and I'm not like, the beautiful thing about quality oils is you don't overconsume them. You consume as much as you consume to be satiated and, to do its job, but you're not deep frying in it. Somebody asked olive oil versus avocado oil. They're really different. They're different sources of fats and they're different flavors. If I had to only pick one, I would pick olive oil because it's way more versatile. But yeah, and sometimes cheaper than avocado oil, actually. But I usually have a few different kinds on hand just because I use them all.
Well, I'm going to stop there just for the sake of time.